Hi, thank you for getting a High Desert Embroidery Kit. This was a project that me, Sarah Lilligard, collaborated with Atelier in Reno and the designer behind it, Kelly Wallace. So we were really excited to put together a kit that would be really approachable for beginners and an opportunity for you to make something that you got to use. So it's printed directly on the bag that you're going to be sewing on and then using after you're done stitching. So for the video, we're going to walk through getting your bag ready to sew on, some of the tools and supplies you'll be using, and then some of the stitches that we covered in the stitch guide. At any point through the video, as you're learning, you can pause it, you can go back. I'm going to be saying the stitch names a number of times, so if you need to look up some diagrams, these would be the names for the stitches that you could look up. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to go to a front view so we can look at my hands as we're working through things. Okay, so first thing, what comes in your kit and what you'll need to provide in addition to that. So the boldest thing that you're going to see are your embroidery thread colors. So we picked out 6 different colors that kind of emphasized what we felt like was kind of the desert palette. High Desert palette. Kelly and I live in the Great Basin area of the Western United States. So these are kind of like fall rosy colors. So those are your embroidery threads, or embroidery floss is the name for it. We also included a number of needles that are on this little needle holder. I tried to include a couple of different sizes of the needles so you can use whatever works for you and your stitching. If you have problems threading your needle, there's also bobbins that you can buy that would help you, needle threaders that you can buy that would help you thread in. The other thing that's included is some paper bobbin cards. I have plastic ones to show you all, but what's included in the kit is a paper version of this. The nice thing with the paper ones is you can easily write on them, and we'll cover how to wind those. And then your bag itself. And what you would need to provide to do your kit is some sort of scissors or snips. I'm working with little snips, pencil or pen, so you can either take notes and label your embroidery bobbins. And it's also included in the kit is your embroidery hoop. So again, all you would need to add to work with is some scissors or snips, pen or pencil, and you're ready to go. So let's talk about getting things set up to work. First thing is we got to organize your embroidery floss. They come on little skeins that have these labels on them, these plastic labels. So in order to keep your threads from getting all tangled, what you want to do is wind them onto your bobbin cards. So you'll slide the labels off and you'll twist them onto your cards. It's pretty self-explanatory once you pull the labels off. The main thing I want to emphasize at this point is that you want to label on your cards. We're working with DMC thread. So that is at the little plastic label. And all the threads have a number associated with them. So you want to write down that number that matches. And what that does is if you happen to run out of thread on a project, you can look up by the company and by the number and get more of that color to match. It's way better than going just by eyesight if you're trying to rematch your colors. So again, really helpful to label the brand and the number in case you need more thread. The thread we provided is more than enough to get you through the project, but if you continue to use these flosses on a different project, that way you're sure to match up the colors, and it's just a good habit to get into as you're working on embroidery projects. So that's got you set for your threads are all organized. You have your other tools around. So then the next thing is getting your bag ready. So for this, what we did was we did a silk screen design. I'm going to turn it so it faces us. There we go. A silk screen design on a recycled cotton bag. And so because it's silk screened, what it allows us to do is to go ahead and wash your design, wash your bag before you stitch on it. I would highly encourage you to do a hot wash, hot dry. And what that allows is the bag to shrink as much as it's going to shrink before you start stitching on it. If you do a hot wash and dry after you stitch, there's a chance that there'll be uneven shrinkage. So your stitches may start to bubble and pucker if they don't shrink at the same rate as the bag. If you're using a more traditional embroidery pattern, they're meant to dissolve when it's washed. So we thought with the silk screen option, it would give us a really clear design to stitch over, and it would also allow you to wash your bag before you start stitching on it. So that would be the main prep thing to do before you start stitching. When you're ready to get down to the sewing, you want to get your embroidery hoop out and you want to push it over your fabric. So I'm going to show you on this burlap that I'll be working with. So the embroidery hoop comes in two parts. There's an inner ring and an outer ring with this little tension knob on it. What you're going to do is sandwich your bag in between these two rings to create tension for you to stitch over. And what that does is it allows you to make even stitches as you're working and maintain tension throughout. And as you move along, you'll see you just kind of move your hoop throughout the design for whatever area you're working on. So I'll show you what that looks like with the bag. So I'm taking the inner ring out. I'm coming to my bag. I'm sliding the inner ring inside. And if, say, we're going to start with the coyote, you can see my rings in there. Then I'm going to take the outer ring, loosen up that tension pin, slide it over top. This really helps to have a table to slide over top. And you can already see as I push down how it's tensioning out some of the wrinkles of the fabric. Okay. And then we're gonna tighten up that pin. So I'm holding it up, keeping it together. And because this cotton fabric is thinner than, say, my burlap, you can go pretty tight on this. It's gonna be close to all the way tightened. Once it's at that point, you can fuss your fabric, that's what I call it, which is just sort of pulling it so it's a bit more taut across the whole ring. So you can see it's looking like that now. So at that point, we're ready to start working on this surface. So we'll set that aside. What I'm going to do to show you the stitches is I'm actually going to be working on this piece of burlap with yarn, which just allows you to see the stitches a little bit better. So we'll set the bag aside for the demo. And I'll get my ring set up over the burlap. Again, it's a little bit thicker, so I adjust my tension pin out. And once it's all secure, then I close that up some so it's fairly taut. Again, you would be doing this on your bag. Okay, so at this point, we're ready to start working through some stitches. So since this is a beginner kit, the only skill I would recommend that you need to feel fairly confident on is threading a needle and knotting it. I'm not going to cover that too much in the video, so I'm just going to assume you feel comfortable doing that. I am going to show you a little trick with your embroidery floss. So with embroidery floss, something that's distinct about it compared to just like a cotton sewing thread is it's actually made up of 6 strands. So if you look at your embroidery floss closely, you'll see those 6 strands intertwined. What this allows you to do is you can separate your strands, which lets you make thinner or thicker stitches. For the sake of teaching, I usually encourage people to just split it in half. That's a little bit easier than trying to thread all 6 strands. And it allows you to practice splitting threads, which can be a little bit fussy. So let me show you how I do that with this embroidery floss. At the top, I separate it into 2 sections, so 3 and 3. Let me get it. So you can see there's 2 tails there, 3 and 3. And then I sandwich it between a couple of my fingers on my hand. So I'm going to pinch and then pinch over here. You can do that with whatever fingers feels confident. I'm using my non-dominant hand to pinch them. Then with my dominant hand, I'm going to go right in that V and I'm going to walk the twist down. And I'm just doing this slowly. You can see the tail's a little bit spinny. Sometimes I lose it because I'm going a little bit slow there. I'm walking the twist all the way out. It can get fussy, so you just keep walking it to the end. So now I have 2 strands of 3. I know the instinct is to just pull them apart with each hand, but what ends up happening is it gets all bunched and tangled as you're pulling. So I find, again, if you can like kind of sandwich between some of your fingers and then walk that V down, that just moves the twist along and then it doesn't get all bundled up as you go. So that's one technique for splitting your threads. At that point, I encourage you to just run your hands down a couple times, your fingers. I'm pinching and running along, and that just moves the twist out of your threads and it helps it from getting bunched up when you're sewing. So again, sandwiching between the fingers, running your finger through to split it, and then taking 1 set of 3, giving it a few massages there, and then you're ready to thread. So again, I'll be working with yarn to show you, so I'm not going to split my yarn, but I did split on that embroidery floss so you can see. I'm going to do a couple of knots on the end, and we're going to get started with our stitches. With the knot, just keep in mind you're just trying to cover the hole that your needle makes in the fabric. If you're kind of a nervous stitcher like me, I like to make a fairly big knot so I'm confident it's not going to pull through. Do whatever works for you. And we're going to get started. The first stitch we're going to do is a straight stitch. So a straight stitch is just essentially what it says. It's going to be moving forward. We're going to start from the back of the fabric. I punched my needle through. I'm pulling it all the way out to the top. And then I'm going to punch back down. Then I'll come up next to it. And go forward. And by that, I mean I'm going ahead of the stitch I just did, going back down. Coming up, going back down. So a straight stitch is essentially you're just going in and out, heading in whichever direction you choose. I'm right hand dominant, so I find I usually stitch from the left to the right. Keep in mind as you're stitching, you can turn your embroidery hoop with your bag, so it's working in a direction that makes sense for you. And we're just going in and out. So I'll do one more. So this is what I call the in and out method, essentially, is when you're punching all the way through the fabric and pulling from the bottom. So your thread goes all the way through, and then you come up and pull all the way through. An easier way to work is what I call working at the surface, which just allows you to keep your needle up above the fabric. It's less intensive on your hands and wrists. You don't have to pull as far, and it's a little bit quicker and smoother. So I'm going to show you the straight stitch now, doing working at the surface. So I'm going to punch down. So we start from the back. So if we're starting new, there would be a knot at the end. I'm coming up from the bottom, pulling through, so my knot's there. And now I'm going to kind of load up my needle. So what I did is I dipped under the fabric, came up, but I didn't pull it yet. So at that point, I'm going to pull through, and you can see I've done a stitch, left that space, and we'll do the same thing again. So it comes down, pops up, and then I go ahead and pull it through. So this is a straight stitch, and I'm doing what I call working at the surface, where I'm not punching all the way through and coming all the way up. I'm just poking my needle through, staying at the top of the fabric. What's happening on the back is I have my finger back here to help. So I'll show you when I load up this. My finger's right here behind the needle, and that's just helping it to stay at the surface. So that's our straight stitch. Some interesting things you can do with the straight stitch is you can make simple shapes. So there's some grasses on our design. So you can do a stitch across, then you can do another stitch right up from that. I'm coming in a little bit next door, my needle's right there, and coming back down. And you can see it's starting to make the grass shape that's on the pattern. So that's a way that the straight stitch can start to make some shapes besides just being an outline. So this, what we're working on right now, is technically an outline stitch. So you would use it to outline a shape, to create lines, curved lines, straight lines. So that's our straight stitch. The next one I'm going to show you is going to be the seed stitch, but first I'm going to talk briefly about knotting off on the back. So once you're done with an area, or you've gotten to the end of your thread, you always want to leave yourself some space when you're getting to the end of your thread, a couple inches, because what we're going to do is knot off onto the fabric. So when I do a knot on the back, I make a really big loop, and I use my finger to hold it down against the fabric while I'm pulling the tail. So my thumb's holding it down against the fabric, I'm pulling to get that tension, and then I end up with a knot at the surface. I'll do that one more time. I make a big loop. My fingers are keeping the tension, meaning I'm holding it against the fabric, while this other one is pulling the tail. And then I can end up with a knot close to the surface. Seed stitch is going to look really familiar. So with our straight stitch, we are doing lines. Again, it's an outline stitch, so it's working around things. Seed stitch can work as more of a fill, and it's just doing kind of like little random straight stitches. So for this, I am doing in and out. So I'm coming in, coming out, and you can see I'm just sort of working through an area, and it's starting to make what's called a fill. So I can use it to fill in a shape with these little seeds, where the stitch just on its own, just one little stitch, starts to look like a seed, a star, a texture. And depending on how you work with it, you can start to make swirls and patterns with that seed stitch as a fill if you work your way around. And again, just in and out, pulling from the front, pushing to the back. And you can see I'm starting to curve it right here. You can also add some other colors. So if you were doing this, say on the coyote shape, you can do all these seed stitches with the different browns that are included to give that coyote a lot of texture and a lot of color variation within its coat. So yeah, real simple. Again, this is a seed stitch and it can be used mostly as a fill and a texture type stitch. I'll knot off on the back. And the next one we're going to do is a back stitch, which is another outline stitch. And it's going to look fairly familiar. We're just sort of building off each stitch. Give it one more knot. That one kind of slipped off the end there. Okay. Okay, something I didn't mention before is with most embroidery, you are doing single thread. So if you've split it to the 3, single thread means that you are leaving a tail. If it was doubled, you would pull that tail all the way down and knot it on itself. But for the embroidery, it's just single. So that means we have this tail here and then the end that's knotted. Okay, so for a back stitch, start by having your knot at the back of the fabric. And this one we are going to be working at the surface. So that means I'm not going to punch down and come up. So I'm going to go into the fabric right here. And I'm going to come up. Looks really familiar to our straight stitch, but this is where the back part comes in. You're going to come and fill in that gap you just made. So I'm connecting, and now I'm going to pop up ahead of the stitch. So now we've got a stitch, a gap. Come back to fill that in. Push your needle ahead. Again, on the back, my fingers helping to keep that needle up. Pull through. Connect. Push up ahead so you have a gap. And pull through. And that is your back stitch. So again, the back part comes is because we leave that gap and then you fill it in and jump ahead. Again, as you're working with these stitches, feel free to keep rotating so it makes sense. If it's easier for you to work in this direction, if it's easier for you to work left to right, right to left. By no means do you have to keep it rigid in one way. Another helpful tip may be holding against your chest the embroidery hoop if you need a sort of brace, or using a table as a way to rest your wrists as you're stitching. So I'll show the beginning one more time. You come up, pull all the way through, go down, pop up so you have a gap, and then you come back to fill that gap. So connect, pop up. You can see my impression of my fingers behind helping me push that needle up to the surface. And push through. So that is the back stitch, which is a good outline stitch. It works really well for straight lines. When you try and do a curve with it, you'll just want to shorten your stitches so you get a smooth arch. You can match them up next to each other, do rows of it for some nice texture. And that's the back stitch. So I'm going to knot this off on the back, and we're going to go to a stem stitch. Threading my needle. With a needle, there's two sides. There's the eye and the point. The eye is where you're threading through. Because I have this yarn, it's a little bit fussier to get in. But some tips can be using some saliva, so you lick your fingers and slide it on there. Trim your ends so it's easier to get it on there. Those are all some ways that can help you get your thread onto the eye of the needle. So at this point, I'm going to pull my tail down. Another tip, if you find that your tail is sliding, like as you're stitching, it's getting further and further down. Once you've threaded your needle, you can give it a few tight pulls to make a kind of crease on the thread to help hold it in place. You can also lick your fingers and give it a couple of tight tugs, and that helps secure the needle on your stretch of thread. And so you aren't sliding your tail off the whole time. So I'm knotting, trimming off some of my tail, and we're going to go on to the stem stitch, which pretty much builds off of what we had just done. So stem stitch, pulling from the back, our knots there. Now, when I do the stem stitch, I'm going to talk about above and below. And what that means is the way that I'm looking at it. I'm talking about my threads either lying above where I'm working or below where I'm working. So that's when I say that, I'm talking in relationship to where it is on the hoop and where I'm working. So above, below, when I use those terms with the stem stitch. So for now, I'm having my thread above. So it's sitting here, and I'm going to stick my needle down, come up, and I'm coming up really close to where that first stitch came through. Little tangle that happens. If it happens, just pause if you catch it in time and work your little tangle out. It's usually because you've gotten your thread too long, or there's a lot of twist in your thread. So in my case, I just have a lot going on here. Okay, so we have a stitch, and you can kind of see right here, they're overlapping, keeping my thread above. And now we're gonna do my needles coming in, popping up to match right next to that stitch, and pulling through. And now you can see that these threads are starting to overlap. I'll do a few more. Down, up, pulling through. My threads above, so it's up here each time I do my stitch. And what that means is there's this really nice overlap that's all smooth. If I were to switch and have my thread down here each time, the overlap changes. I'll do one more. And you'll be able to see it on yours, but it just moves your line. So when I talk about above and below with the stem stitch, just pick one direction, one side of where you're stitching to keep your thread, and that will help you keep an even line. You can see Now that there's a little bit of a jump where I switched from having my thread above versus below. Okay, I'm going to start that one more time, and then we'll move on to our next stitch. Okay, so again, this is the stem stitch. Start from the bottom with your knot, pull to the surface. Okay, my thread is above the area that I'm stitching in relationship to how I'm looking at it. Come in, pop up right next door to where you started, pull through, threads above where I'm working, go down, pop up right next door, pull through, and that's making this overlap. It kind of has a rope look to it, which makes it a really nice textured outline stitch. Oh, and see, that's too much thread there. Okay, I'm gonna come back and knot, and we're gonna move on to a more decorative stitch. Okay, so now we're gonna do our next stitch is called a lazy daisy. And it's a stitch that makes the thing it says. So it's actually making a daisy. So we knotted our thread starting from the back, come up, and you're going to lay your thread on the surface and come back in right next to where you came out. But you don't want to pull it too tight, because this thread on the surface is what's going to make your daisy petal. So pull it in, and then you'll catch it and pin down that petal. So at that point, you can pull it a bit tighter, and you secure that petal in place. So I'll show you that again, working from the surface. So it makes this little arch. And again, that's made with just the thread laying at the surface, and you've pinned it in place. So we'll do another one over here. Comes out, lay the thread on the surface. I'm going to put my needle in right next door to where we came out, and I'm going to push it up out where I want the end of my petal to be. And then I'm going to pin it in place with a little stitch just on the other side of that petal, so it secures it in place. So what it looks like up close is your thread is laying on the surface, and there's a little stitch at the end of your petal to keep it down. If your petals are getting really thin, it's because you're pulling everything very tight. So you do want to leave it a little bit loose if you want sort of wider petals. I'll do one more here. And this is a good opportunity to talk quickly about if things are getting bunched on the back. It just means your thread's getting twisted or there's too much. So I'm going to hold this up towards the surface and let that sort of spin out, massage some of that twist out, and then we should be good to go back without it getting bunched. So I'm just helping pull some of that twist out. Okay, one more petal around at the surface, go in right next door, pop up out here where I want my petal to be. I'm going to go ahead and catch that thread around. And dive down to pin it into place. So this is a little bit of a wider petal because I didn't do these 2 stitches as close. These are adjustments you can make depending on how you want those petals to look. So this again was called the Lazy Daisy. It's used to make these petal shapes, which fits some of the shapes in our high desert design. One is the French knot, which is doing a knot at the surface of the fabric. So for that, we have a knot at the end of our thread. We're gonna poke up. See, we'll do it down here. Pull to the surface. And this is a little bit of a fussy stitch. So you're gonna be using both your hands. Okay, have your needle perpendicular to the thread. I'm wrapping my thread around that needle, maintaining some tension so you can see it's pretty taut. And I'm gonna do it, I'll do it 3 times. So perpendicular, wrapping my thread around 1, 2, 3. Oh, and that's, my knot was 2. Okay, so French knot coming up, pulling to the surface. You want to lay it down. You're going to hold your needle perpendicular to the thread and you're wrapping your thread around. We're going to do it 3 times. 1, 2, 3. Notice things are pretty taut. It's important you want to keep things tight so you have a nice French knot. Maintain that tension. And I'm going to dive down right next door to where I came up. So now I've got thread wrapped around the needle. I'm going back down. And as I'm going in, notice this hand is maintaining some control over this thread as I'm pulling through. And that's going to create your knot that's sitting at the surface. This is the French knot. So you can see at an angle, it definitely pops up more than the other stitches. We'll do it again. Come up to the surface, pull through. I have to set it down to needle goes perpendicular to the thread. We're gonna wrap it 1, 2, 3 times. Notice that there's a fair amount of tension on that needle and thread, so things are pretty tight. I'm going to push my needle in right next door to where I came out. And I'm going to pull through while I'm holding that thread. So the tension's staying pretty taut. If it's too tight, you can let it loosen up a little bit and then pull through. So the big thing with the French knot is that you're helping to maintain your tension. If your knot's falling apart, try adjusting how hard you're holding the thread while you're pulling your needle back through, how tight you're winding onto your needle. If you're not able to pull your knot, then it means you need to loosen your tension a little bit. Okay, that's the French knot. Tie off on the back. And the last one I'm going to show you is the satin stitch. Okay, satin stitch is a fill stitch, so it's really good for filling in big areas. It uses a lot of thread, but it looks really nice and creates a sort of smooth texture over an area. For the satin stitch, you just want to be careful about not getting too ambitious. If you cover too big of an area, your thread's going to lose its tension over time and start to like bunch up off of the fabric. So for example, for these leaf shapes, I'm going to work from this side to that. So working on the shorter sides or work at an angle across this way. So I'm never doing this huge line all in one stitch. So satin stitch, come up from the bottom on your line to the surface, go across and dive back down. This is one that works well just to go in and out, not working at the surface. Next door, come up, go across. So it's kind of like coloring. You're just filling in those lines. It's very forgiving. So if there's gaps like this little one I made, you can just go back and fill them in. You can add different colors as you do the satin stitch, so you have some additional texture and color. Variation, this is again a nice thing for the coyote or the sagebrush leaves. And that's really all there is to it for the satin stitch. You're just going from one side to the other. It does use a fair amount of thread, and you want to be careful about your tension so that you're not working in too big of an area. And that your fabric's fairly tight as you're stitching it. So a few final notes. You can definitely use a whole bunch of other stitches. There's lots of embroidery stitches out there to work from. These were just some suggestions. It's ones that I usually teach for beginners. I feel like they're all very approachable stitches. And once you have a couple of these down, you can really cover a pattern very nicely with them. If you ever get tangled up on the back, you can take stitches out. You can undo knots. You can knot off. Any of those things totally works. Don't get too hung up on how things work on the back. If you do want it to be fairly clean, stop and start a lot. Finish off an area, tie a knot, even if you're not at the end of your thread, and move to the next area. And that helps the back of your design look a bit cleaner. Some other notes on finishing your bag. Since this will be used, you may want to do some gluing of your knots on the inside if you're worried about them coming out. So you can use just a little bit of fabric glue dotted on there. You can also iron a piece of Pellon on the inside to keep it looking clean. But with doing some nice knots, you shouldn't have any problems with long-term use of your bag with the embroidery. So thank you again for working with our High Desert Embroidery Kit. I hope you enjoy playing with it, trying out colors and different stitches.